Clean it up. That's what you people do, right? The words landed before the wine even finished spilling, sharp and careless, slicing through the low hum of conversation like glass against marble. And for a moment, the entire ballroom at the Hale Foundation Gala seemed to forget how to breathe as a deep red stain spread slowly across the front of Marcus Ellington's charcoal suit, the liquid catching the golden chandelier light as it dripped, one measured drop at a time, onto the polished floor beneath him, while a few scattered laughs rose too. Quickly from the edges of the room, nervous, uncertain, unsure whether they were witnessing a joke or a line that should never have been crossed, and Marcus didn't move, not at first, his hand still resting lightly at his side, fingers relaxed, posture steady, as if the weight of the moment had been placed somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the reach of embarrassment or anger, while Victoria Hale lowered her glass with a faint, satisfied smile, her wrist still tilted from the motion, diamonds catching the light like tiny flashes of approval as she looked him over the way one might glance at a misplaced object in a carefully arranged room. Something out of place, something that didn't belong, and around them, tailored suits shifted subtly, shoulders tightening, eyes darting between the two, searching for cues, for permission, for someone to define what this moment meant, but Marcus gave them nothing, no flinch, no sharp inhale, no defensive word, just a quiet stillness that felt heavier than any reaction could have been as the scent of red wine lingered faintly in the air, mixing with expensive cologne and polished wood, while a server paused mid-step several feet away, tray hovering uncertainly, caught between duty and instinct, and Victoria let out a soft, dismissive breath, reaching for a linen napkin from a nearby table and flicking it toward him with a careless gesture that stopped just short of contact, the fabric drifting down in slow motion before settling near his shoes, and still, Marcus didn't bend to pick it up, didn't acknowledge it at all, his gaze lifting instead, calm and direct, not confrontational, not submissive, just present in a way that made the space around him feel suddenly smaller, tighter, as if the room itself had begun to close in on its own discomfort, while across the floor, Richard Hale stood near a cluster of investors, his attention half-turned, half-dismissive, the faintest crease forming between his brows as he registered the disturbance but chose not to intervene, trusting, perhaps, that whatever this was would resolve itself without his involvement, because people like Marcus were meant to fade, to apologize, to step back into the invisible lines drawn for them. But Marcus remained exactly where he was, the stain spreading, the silence stretching, the weight of unspoken expectation pressing in from every direction. And when he finally moved, it was not to wipe the wine away or to defend himself, but simply to adjust the cuff of his sleeve with quiet precision, as if the moment required nothing more than order, nothing more than control, and that single, deliberate motion shifted something intangible in the room, a subtle fracture in the narrative everyone thought they understood, though no one could yet explain why. Marcus Ellington had learned a long time ago that silence could carry more weight than any argument, and as the faint murmur of the ballroom slowly returned around him, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with measured calm, not to check the damage but to retrieve a neatly folded handkerchief, the fabric crisp and white against the dark stain as he pressed it lightly to the wine without urgency, without shame, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, as if this was not the first time the world had tried to reduce him to something smaller than he was, and somewhere behind the stillness of his expression lived a memory far removed from chandeliers and polished marble, a narrow kitchen with flickering fluorescent light, his mother standing over a sink that never quite drained right, sleeves rolled, hands steady even when the day had not been kind, telling him in a voice that never raised itself that dignity was not something anyone could give or take, it was something you carried, even when others refused to see it. And that lesson had followed him through every room he had ever entered, from crowded classrooms where teachers misread quiet for lack of ability, to boardrooms where his ideas were questioned until someone else repeated them, louder, paler, more acceptable, and each time he had chosen the same response, not retreat, not confrontation, but presence, a quiet insistence on existing fully in spaces that were not built for him. And now, standing in the center of a room filled with people who measured worth in net value and last names, he carried that same steadiness, the same refusal to shrink, while a man near the bar leaned toward another guest and whispered something under his breath, eyes flicking toward Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal, as if trying to place him into a category that made sense. Staff, guest, someone's plus one, anything but what he actually was, and Marcus could feel those glances the way one feels a change in temperature, subtle but unmistakable. Yet he did not turn to meet them, did not offer explanation or correction, because he understood something they did not. That clarity did not always need to be immediate, that sometimes the truth of a person revealed itself best when others had already decided who they believed you to be. And across the room, Victoria had already shifted her attention, laughing lightly with a group of donors, the moment dismissed as easily as it had been created, her confidence unshaken, built on years of moving through spaces where consequences rarely followed her actions. While Marcus lowered the handkerchief and folded it once more, the deep red now muted but still visible, a mark that would not disappear completely, and he let his gaze drift briefly across the room, not searching, not challenging, simply observing, taking in the arrangement of power, the subtle hierarchies, the way certain people stood a little taller because they believed they could. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded to himself, a small acknowledgement of something already decided, something already set in motion long before this night had begun, as if the moment unfolding here was not an interruption, but a confirmation. And when he finally stepped forward, it was not toward Victoria or the center of attention, but along the edge of the room, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged, leaving behind the faint imprint of a presence that had not asked for recognition, yet somehow made its absence immediately felt. Richard Hale did not notice Marcus leaving at first, because men like Richard were accustomed to being the center of gravity in every room they entered, their conversations louder, their presence heavier, their decisions assumed to matter more. And as he stood beneath a crystal chandelier, discussing projected returns with two venture partners, his voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never had to question whether the world would make space for him, while Victoria rejoined him with a light laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her shoulder as if nothing of consequence had occurred, her tone casual, dismissive, already rewriting the moment into something smaller, something forgettable. And Richard gave her a brief glance, more curious than concerned, asking in a low voice what had caused the brief pause in the room earlier, to which she replied with a shrug and a faint smile that it was nothing, just someone who did not belong. And that answer satisfied him more than it should have, because it aligned with the quiet assumptions he carried without ever examining. That belonging could be determined at a glance, that worth could be measured by appearance, by familiarity, by the unspoken rules of rooms like this one. And around them the evening resumed its rhythm, glasses clinking softly, a string quartet playing near the far wall, the soft hum of wealth moving like a current beneath every conversation. Yet something had shifted in a way no one could quite name, a subtle tension threading through the space like a note just slightly off pitch, while one of the junior partners, a man new enough to still notice details others ignored, leaned closer to Richard and mentioned that the man Victoria had dismissed did not look like staff, not in the way he carried himself, not in the way he stood, so still under scrutiny. But Richard waved it off with a brief shake of his head, uninterested in entertaining uncertainty on a night that was meant to celebrate certainty, because tomorrow morning was what mattered, the contract waiting on his desk, the $1.5 billion agreement that would elevate his firm into a different tier entirely, a deal he had spent months securing, aligning investors, negotiating terms, building toward a moment that felt inevitable now. And in his mind, everything about it was already settled, the signatures of formality, the outcome guaranteed. While Victoria lifted her glass again, her expression bright, her confidence intact, unaware that the room had not entirely let go of what it had witnessed, that a few eyes still followed the path Marcus had taken toward the edge of the ballroom, replaying the quiet in his response. The absence of reaction that felt less like submission and more like something else, something harder to define. And near the exit, a hotel manager stood with a tablet in hand, his posture tightening as Marcus approached, recognition flickering across his face for just a fraction of a second before he quickly straightened, offering a polite nod that carried a hint of deference not extended to most guests, a small detail, easily missed, yet enough to suggest that not everyone in the room had misread the man they had just watched, and Marcus acknowledged the gesture with the slightest incline of his head before stepping through the doors into the cooler air of the corridor beyond, where the noise of the gala softened into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet hum of recessed lighting and the steady rhythm of his own footsteps against the carpeted floor, measured, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, as if the night behind him was already finished, even though for everyone else, it had only just begun. The corridor outside the ballroom felt different, quieter, as if the air itself carried less expectation, and Marcus Ellington slowed his steps just slightly, the soft carpet absorbing the sound beneath his polished shoes, while the distant echo of laughter and music faded behind closed doors, replaced by the low hum of ventilation and the occasional muted chime of an elevator arriving somewhere down the hall. And he paused near a floor-to-ceiling window where the city stretched out below in a grid of light and motion, headlights moving like steady currents through the dark, each one carrying someone somewhere important to them, somewhere that did not require permission to exist, and for a moment, he simply stood there, his reflection faint in the glass, the dark stain still visible across his jacket, a reminder of a moment that had already passed but had not been forgotten, not by him, not by the room he had just left, even if they chose to pretend otherwise, and he reached up, not to wipe it away again, but to straighten the line of his collar, adjusting it with the same care he would bring to any decision, any meeting, any negotiation, because details mattered, not for appearances, but for clarity, and clarity was something he never allowed himself to lose, not in rooms filled with doubt, not in moments designed to provoke reaction, and certainly not now, when the path ahead had already begun to take shape long before a single drop of wine had touched his suit, and behind him, the quiet shift of footsteps signaled someone approaching, the hotel manager from earlier, his pace measured, respectful, stopping at a distance that acknowledged both proximity and space, his voice low as he spoke, offering assistance, perhaps a replacement jacket, perhaps something to make the situation more comfortable. But Marcus turned his head just enough to acknowledge him with a calm expression and a slight shake of his head, declining without a word, because comfort was not what he required, and the manager seemed to understand, nodding once before stepping back, leaving him again with the silence and the city beyond the glass. And Marcus let out a slow breath, not heavy, not burdened, just steady, as if releasing something unnecessary, something that did not belong to him in the first place. And then he reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out his phone, the screen lighting softly against his palm as he glanced at a message already waiting, a confirmation from his assistant, time, location, the final details for the meeting scheduled in the morning, everything aligned, everything prepared, and his thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before he typed a short response. A single adjustment, a subtle shift that would not seem significant to anyone else reading it, but to him, it marked a decision already made, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in alignment with something far more consistent, something he had carried through every stage of his life, the understanding that respect was not an accessory to success, it was a condition of it, and once that condition was broken, there was no negotiation left to be had. And as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, his reflection in the glass seemed sharper somehow, more defined, the city lights framing him in quiet contrast. And when he finally turned away from the window and began walking toward the elevators, his pace remained unhurried, his posture unchanged, but there was a finality in the movement, a quiet certainty that whatever had begun in that ballroom was not going to end there, not with raised voices or public confrontation, but somewhere far more decisive, somewhere the rules were written in ink instead of assumption, and where silence could no longer be mistaken for weakness. Back inside the ballroom, the rhythm of the evening had fully recovered on the surface, but beneath it, something restless lingered, subtle and difficult to name, like a note that refused to resolve, and Richard Hale felt it without quite understanding why. His attention drifting more than usual as conversations circled around projected growth and acquisition strategies, his responses slightly delayed, his focus splitting between the present and the anticipation of the morning ahead, because the contract waiting for him was not just another deal. It was the deal, the one that would secure his position among the most powerful firms in the room, the one that had already been discussed, outlined, nearly finalized with a partner whose name carried weight far beyond most. And yet, for reasons he could not clearly articulate, the image of the man Victoria had dismissed kept returning to him, not the stain on the suit, not the moment itself, but the stillness that followed it, the absence of reaction that did not align with the role Richard had unconsciously assigned him. And he found himself glancing toward the exit more than once, as if expecting something unresolved to walk back through the door, while across from him, Victoria continued as she always did, her voice confident, her laughter effortless, recounting the moment now as a light anecdote to a small circle of guests who responded with polite amusement, their smiles careful, their agreement measured, because even in spaces like this, there were lines that some recognized but chose not to challenge. And one of the investors, an older man with a habit of noticing what others overlooked, tilted his head slightly as he listened, his expression thoughtful rather than entertained, his gaze shifting briefly toward the door Marcus had exited through before returning to Richard, asking in a tone that carried more curiosity than judgment whether Richard knew the man, and Richard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to betray uncertainty before he answered that he did not, that it was nothing. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Words that sounded complete but felt incomplete even as he said them. And the investor nodded slowly, not convinced, not unconvinced, simply storing the moment away as something worth remembering, while the music swelled slightly near the stage, and a server moved through the crowd offering fresh glasses, the surface of the evening polished back into place. Yet Richard's thoughts continued to drift, drawn toward the details he had initially dismissed, the way the hotel manager had reacted, the way the room had gone quiet in a manner that felt less like amusement and more like recognition delayed, and a faint unease began to settle in, not strong enough to disrupt the night, but present enough to linger at the edges of his awareness. And when he finally reached into his jacket to check the time, his phone screen lit up with a calendar reminder for the morning meeting, the one marked in bold, the one he had been working toward for months, and beneath the time and location was the name of the company he would be meeting, Ellington Dynamics, displayed in clean, simple text that carried no immediate emotional weight, until, slowly, almost reluctantly, a connection began to form, faint at first, then sharper, as memory aligned with recognition, not fully, not yet, but enough to make his grip on the phone tighten just slightly, enough to make him look once more toward the exit, as if the answer might still be standing there, waiting to be seen, while somewhere down the corridor, far from the music and the carefully controlled laughter, Marcus Ellington stepped into an elevator, the doors sliding closed with a soft, final sound that marked the end of the evening for him, even as, for those still inside the ballroom, the real consequence of what had just happened had only begun to take shape. The elevator doors closed with a soft, sealed hush, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a quiet, enclosed stillness where the only sound was the low mechanical hum as the car began its descent, steady and unhurried. While Marcus Ellington stood alone beneath the muted overhead lights, his reflection mirrored faintly in the brushed steel walls, multiplied into quiet silhouettes that moved with him, each one carrying the same composed posture, the same unshaken calm. And he did not look away from that reflection, did not turn his gaze downward or outward, but held it there as if measuring something deeper than appearance, something rooted far beneath the surface of a stained suit or a single moment of disrespect. And the faint scent of wine still lingered, subtle now, no longer sharp, blending into the neutral air of the elevator as if it too was already fading into memory. Yet the mark remained, visible, undeniable, a physical trace of what had happened, and still, his breathing remained even, controlled, each inhale deliberate, each exhale quiet, as if the rhythm itself anchored him to something constant, something unchanging regardless of the space he occupied. And in that stillness, there was no anger rising, no need for retaliation forming, only clarity, a quiet alignment between what had occurred and what would follow. Because for Marcus, moments like these were never isolated. They were signals, confirmations of truths he had learned long before rooms like that ballroom had ever opened their doors to him. Truths about how quickly perception could become judgment, How easily dignity could be tested when power believed itself unchallenged, and how important it was to respond not with impulse, but with intention. And as the elevator passed each floor, the numbers lighting up in soft succession, he allowed himself a single, brief closing of his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in focus, as if narrowing the world down to its simplest form, action and consequence, cause and response. And somewhere in that quiet narrowing, the memory of his mother's voice returned again, steady and unwavering, reminding him that character was not proven when things were easy, but when they were not. And when he opened his eyes, there was no hesitation left, no uncertainty lingering in the edges of his thoughts, only a calm certainty that what needed to be done was already decided. And far above, the ballroom continued its performance, laughter rising, glasses clinking, conversations flowing as if untouched by what had unfolded, while Richard Hale stood with his phone still in hand, the name Ellington Dynamics staring back at him with a growing weight, the connection now clearer, sharper, the unease no longer subtle but settling deeper, heavier, as realization began to take shape in slow, deliberate pieces, and he shifted his stance slightly, the confidence that had defined his evening beginning to thin at the edges, replaced by a quiet tension he could not yet explain aloud. While Victoria remained unaware, her world still intact, her certainty unbroken, moving through the room with the same effortless ease, and between these two spaces, the silent elevator descending and the bright ballroom above, a line had already been drawn, invisible but irreversible, separating what had been from what was about to come. And as the elevator slowed, the motion easing into stillness before the doors prepared to open, Marcus adjusted his jacket one final time, not to hide the stain, but to settle it, to carry it with him as it was, unaltered, a reminder not of what had been taken from him, but of what he had chosen not to give away. And when the doors slid open, he stepped forward without pause, his stride steady, his expression unchanged, moving into the quiet hallway beyond with the same calm presence he had held all along, leaving behind not just a room, but a moment that had already begun to echo in ways no one inside could yet fully understand. The next morning arrived with a kind of clarity that only comes after a night where something important has shifted, the sky outside the glass towers pale and clean, the city already moving with purpose as commuters filled the streets below, and inside a high-rise conference room, nearly 30 floors above it all, everything was arranged with precision. A long polished table stretching beneath soft recessed lighting, leather chairs aligned perfectly, screens prepared, documents printed and stacked with exact edges, every detail reflecting the magnitude of what was about to take place. And Richard Hale stood near the head of the table adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection faint in the dark glass behind him as he checked his watch for the third time in less than 5 minutes, a habit he did not usually have. But this morning felt different in a way he could not fully explain, the unease from the night before still present, now sharpened into something more focused, more insistent. As the name on the meeting agenda sat at the front of his mind with growing weight, Ellington Dynamics, and around him, his team moved with quiet efficiency, assistants placing water glasses exactly 2 inches from each folder, a junior analyst reviewing figures one last time, the room humming with controlled anticipation, while Victoria sat near the far end of the table, her posture relaxed, her confidence unchanged, scrolling briefly through her phone before setting it aside with a faint smile, as if this meeting was simply another step in a series of predictable successes. And Richard glanced at her, considering for a moment whether to mention the thought that had been forming since last night, the image, the connection, the possibility that the man from the gala might not have been who they assumed. But the words never fully formed, held back by the same instinct that had dismissed the moment in the first place. The belief that things like that did not intersect with deals like this, that the worlds were separate, ordered, predictable, until the door at the far end of the conference room opened with a quiet, controlled motion, and the subtle shift in the air was immediate. Conversations paused, movement slowed, attention redirected in a single, collective turn, and for a fraction of a second, no one spoke, because the man who stepped inside did not rush, did not announce himself, did not need to. His presence carrying a quiet authority that filled the space without effort. His suit now replaced, clean, perfectly. Tailored, every line precise, every detail intentional. And as he moved forward, the soft sound of his shoes against the floor measured and steady. Richard felt the final piece fall into place with a clarity that left no room for denial. The stillness from the night before, the recognition in the manager's eyes, the name on the contract, all of it aligning in a single undeniable truth. And Marcus Ellington met his gaze not with challenge, not with anger, but with the same calm composure he had carried all along, as if nothing about this moment required anything more than presence. And as he reached the table, setting a slim folder down with quiet precision, the room remained suspended in a silence that no one dared to break first, because the realization had already arrived, heavy and irreversible, and everything that had seemed certain just hours ago now stood on ground that no longer felt as stable as it once had. No one moved at first, because the weight of recognition had already settled into the room before a single word was spoken, and Richard Hale felt it more than anyone. The slow tightening in his chest, the quiet collapse of certainty as Marcus Ellington took his seat at the opposite side of the table with calm precision, placing his hands lightly on the polished surface as if this moment had always belonged to him, as if nothing about it required adjustment or reaction, and the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before Richard cleared his throat, his voice attempting to regain its usual authority but falling just slightly short, the edges less certain than they had been the night before, as he began to speak about the partnership, the projections, the mutual benefit that had brought them here, words that had been rehearsed, refined, expected to land with confidence, yet now felt strangely fragile in the presence of something far more grounded. While Marcus listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his gaze steady, offering no immediate indication of agreement or resistance, simply allowing the words to exist in the space between them. And across the table, Victoria sat still, her earlier composure replaced by a tension she could not fully conceal, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on Marcus with a recognition that had come too late, replaying the previous night in sharp, unwanted clarity. The gesture, the words, the assumption, each detail now carrying a weight she had not considered in the moment. And as Richard finished speaking, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites response, that expects continuation. But Marcus did not rush to fill it, instead reaching for the folder he had placed on the table, opening it with deliberate care, the soft sound of paper against wood cutting through the quiet as he glanced down. For only a second before looking back up, meeting Richard's eyes directly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of anger, no raised tone, no need to assert control, because control was already present in the stillness he held, and he said that the terms were clear, the opportunity significant, the numbers aligned. But there was one element that could not be accounted for in projections or contracts, something that did not appear in spreadsheets or negotiations. And Richard's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table as he listened, already understanding where this was going, already feeling the shift that could no longer be avoided, while Victoria leaned forward just enough to speak, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence, offering an apology that felt incomplete even as it left her lips, words shaped by urgency rather than reflection. And Marcus acknowledged her with the slightest nod, not dismissive, not accepting, simply recognizing that it had been said. And then he continued, his tone unchanged, explaining that respect was not a clause that could be added after the fact, not a condition that could be negotiated once it had already been broken, and the room remained completely still, every person present aware that something irreversible was unfolding, not through raised voices or confrontation, but through a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. And Marcus closed the folder gently, sliding it forward across the table with controlled precision until it rested just within Richard's reach, the motion quiet, final, and he stated, without emphasis, without hesitation, that the agreement would not be moving forward, that the decision had already been made, not in this room, not in this moment, but the night before, and the words settled into the space like something permanent, something that could not be undone, while Richard sat there, the full weight of consequence now undeniable, the realization complete, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, he had no immediate response, no argument, No strategy, only silence in a room that had been built on the assumption that power always had a voice. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, because the kind of silence that filled the room was not empty. It was heavy, layered with realization, with consequence, with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had just taken place, and Marcus Ellington did not wait for a response that he knew would not come in any meaningful form. Instead, he rose from his seat with the same calm precision he had carried into the room, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound against the floor, the movement neither abrupt nor delayed, simply timed as if it had always been part of the outcome. And as he reached for the folder, closing it fully this time, and drawing it back toward himself, the light from the windows caught briefly along the edge of the table, reflecting upward in a thin line that passed across his hands, steady, unshaken, while across from him, Richard Hale remained seated, his posture no longer defined by confidence, but by stillness, his gaze fixed somewhere between the contract and the man who had just withdrawn it, as if trying to trace back the exact moment where the path had changed, where certainty had given way to consequence. Yet the answer was already known, already present in the memory he could not undo. And Victoria sat beside him, her hands resting tightly together, her expression no longer composed but restrained, the absence of words now louder than anything she had said the night before, because in this space, there was no audience to impress, no laughter to hide behind, only the quiet clarity of what had been done and what it had cost. And around the table, the others remained, motionless, their presence reduced to observation, witnesses to a shift in power that had not required force, only decision. And Marcus adjusted his jacket once more, not to conceal anything, but to settle it into place, the fabric smooth, the line clean, as if the mark from the night before no longer needed to be seen to be understood, and he gave a small, respectful nod, not directed at any single person, but at the room itself, an acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. And then he turned, his steps measured and quiet as he moved toward the door, the sound of each footstep spaced evenly across the polished floor, echoing just enough to be heard, not enough to disturb. And when he reached the handle, he paused for the briefest fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in completion, as if allowing the silence behind him to settle fully into place. And then he opened the door and stepped out into the corridor beyond, where the light was softer, the air cooler, and the noise of the city returned in distant layers, muted through glass and height, and the door closed behind him with a gentle, final click that seemed louder than it was, because it marked the end of something more than a meeting, more than a contract. It marked the boundary between what had been assumed and what had been revealed, and inside the room, no one moved to follow, no one spoke to fill the space. Because there are moments when the absence of action says more than any response could. And outside, Marcus continued down the hallway without looking back, his reflection passing briefly across the glass panels that lined the corridor, steady, composed, unchanged, as if the world had not shifted at all, yet everything that mattered had already been decided in the quiet space between action and consequence, where dignity had remained intact, and that, more than anything else in the room behind him, was what could not be taken away.